In the castle on the magnificent Crumble Hill, something unusual was happening. A beautiful girl named Amber, the pain of her decision reflected in her eyes, was standing before a broad-shouldered man. Jim was Amber's husband, and he looked at her with eyes that hid a burning passion. Just as Jim was about to kiss Amber, she revealed her family's terrible secret. She was not her mother's biological daughter. Overcome with guilt, the girl couldn't stay in Jim's arms and broke free from him. But Jim didn't seem particularly concerned about Amber's secret. He approached her again and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Amber, captivated by her husband, didn't realize that in the next moment he would begin to kiss her passionately. Jim's passion overwhelmed him, blocking out all other emotions, and he pushed Amber onto the bed. When she saw his naked body, she was consumed by fear as she had never seen such a sight before. Despite her desperate resistance, Jim continued to kiss her body relentlessly. In despair, Amber covered her face with her hands, not wanting Jim to see her tears. He had no time for her tears. He wanted to make her pay for her deception, but he restrained himself. The girl understood that if she didn't go through with the divorce, she would fall in love again, and it would all be over. Jim was the emperor's nephew and was appointed commander-in-chief of the army. Amber was the daughter of a Marquis, known for her extraordinary beauty. One day, she secretly snuck into a ball held at the castle by her family to celebrate a festival, which she was forbidden to attend. After discovering her at the ball, her mother flew into a rage and unleashed all her fury upon her. As punishment, Amber's mother locked her in an empty, filthy closet. After sitting there for several hours, having completely lost hope, she heard the click of the lock opening, and he appeared in the doorway. Jim walked up to Amber and, without a word, gently took her hand and led her forward. The two walked out onto a balcony overlooking a beautiful garden, but neither dared to break the silence. Jim looked at Amber, understanding that she was still so young, just a child, but he had his own reasons for approaching her. Deep down, he felt awkward with her and didn't know how to start a conversation. But suddenly, Amber broke the silence, asking for the name of her savior. To his own surprise, Jim was captivated by her voice. He introduced himself and briefly told her about himself. But that was their last conversation. Many years later, Jim not only became a war hero, but also acquired land and a magnificent castle in East Mason. After receiving the title of Duke, Jim proposed to Amber, and they were married. Amber was happy to finally be free from her parents' grasp, with her destiny by her side. But not all was as it seemed. One morning, Amber came to wish her husband a good morning, but the Duke was somewhat cold in his response to her. Jim didn't understand why she had come to him or what she hoped to achieve by doing so. Jim's harsh words pierced Amber's heart, and she could no longer answer him. The Duke said she could do anything from renovating the castle to organizing receptions. However, he demanded that she no longer disturb him with her presence, and with those words, he left the hall. Amber was left alone, wondering why he had married her if he was so cold towards her. Jim was always busy with his own affairs, so Amber was always alone, even at mealtimes. She wondered what was wrong with her husband, why he was so cold to her, and if she had done something wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted by a maid who entered the dining room to announce that Amber's father had come see her. For a moment, she was happy, not because her father had come, but because for at least a little while, she would no longer be alone. Marquis Morgan Alloy sat in the living room, his expression sour as only his daughter had come out to greet him. Amber tried to make excuses for Jim, saying he had many things to attend to at work, and that was why he couldn't greet the Marquis. Morgan was not satisfied with his daughter's answer and made a few more barbed remarks about the Duke. After satisfying his own vanity, the Marquis handed his daughter a strange bottle and told her to secretly give it to the Duke on their wedding night to maintain his masculine vigor. Amber didn't understand why she needed this strange bottle with its suspicious contents. As if reading his daughter's mind, Morgan explained that it was time to tie him to her side so he wouldn't go philandering. Amber was still very young and was shocked by what her father was asking of her. However, Morgan did not back down, pushing the potion towards his daughter again and adding that only a child could secure her position. The Marquis looked at his daughter arrogantly, repeating his words and implying it was her duty. The girl was stunned by her father's words and fought back tears. She took the bottle anyway and hid it in her box. All day, Amber thought about that strange conversation with her father. She didn't understand how she could do what he asked. A wave of heat washed over her whenever she remembered how insistently her father had spoken about using the potion. Morgan's face had shown without a doubt that this was exactly what his daughter had to do for her own future. But this was not the future the young lady had dreamed of as she clutched the bottle to her chest. The conversation between father and daughter ended as strangely as it had begun, with Morgan leaving after a few more contemptuous remarks about the Duke's absence. Amber was left alone once more, watching her father leave, hoping he would say a kind word to her. The girl's hopes were dashed. She realized again how alone she was in this world. Snapping out of her memories, the girl decided to ask the local doctor what kind of medicine her father had given her. An hour later, Duke Jim received a guest. The guest turned out to be Amber's father, Marquis Morgan Alloy, who had come to Jim to deliver a letter from the Emperor. Morgan handed the letter to the Duke, noting that it was very important and that the Emperor had ordered it to be delivered to him personally. Jim let out a small laugh, saying the old Marquis was well suited for the role of a messenger who had traveled halfway across the empire to deliver a letter. Morgan was enraged by the insolent young man's words and retaliated. The Marquis accused the Duke of disloyalty to the throne and claimed that Morgan's visit was to set things in order. Hearing the accusation of disloyalty, Jim gave a sarcastic smile. The Duke said thoughtfully that his marriage to the Marquis's daughter was already a sign of loyalty, and he didn't understand what more the Emperor wanted. The old Marquis put on an important air and began to talk about how he and Amber needed to have a child, and then the Emperor would leave him alone. However, Jim was no fool and understood Morgan's intentions. The birth of a child would mean giving up the ducal title. Jim now realized what they wanted, an heir they could control. The Marquis tried to convince the Duke that this was not a bad thing, as the heir would be his own son, and the child would carry his blood. After a moment of thought, the Duke replied that if it was the Emperor's will, he could not object. But he added that since the most important thing to the Emperor was that the heir had his bloodline, then the child's mother was not so important. Morgan screamed at the Duke's words. He could not tolerate such insolence. Jim immediately explained that he could not have a child with the Marquis's daughter because, looking at her, he saw the shadow of Morgan, whom he despised. Before the old man could answer, the Duke rose proudly and left. Morgan was so angry he was sputtering. He had never seen such an impudent person. By then, Jim and his servant had already left the room, him striding with his head held high, completely ignoring the old man's incoherent shouts. The Marquis, left in the room, finally controlled himself and swore to make the Duke pay for his words. The next morning, Jim was in the dining room eating breakfast and reading the Emperor's letter when Amber suddenly appeared in the doorway. She moved like a swan on water, and if she weren't who she was, perhaps there could have been a chance for them. After sitting down at the table, Amber almost immediately felt sad, as her husband, as usual, paid her no mind. Jim continued to read the letter, and only after a while said that he was going to see the Emperor. Before Amber could feel sad about being left alone again, the Duke announced that she would be going with him. Her joy was indescribable. She could finally leave the castle and have some fun. Amber was lost in thought for a moment, thinking about how everything would go, what she should bring, what to wear, and how to behave. But when she turned her attention to Jim, all her joy vanished, as he once again had a cold and distant look. Meanwhile, Jim was reminiscing about the past, wondering what more the Emperor needed and why he still didn't trust him, his own nephew. After all, it was the Duke who had dedicated himself to the Empire since he was 17. He fought for the Emperor's lands. Behind Jim were thousands of deaths. All these years, he had walked over mountains of corpses. He had even agreed to marry the daughter of the old Marquis, that servant of the Emperor. And even after all that, they dared to accuse him of disloyalty. After finishing breakfast, Jim decided to leave, only telling Amber that he would go on ahead. Amber, like a devoted wife, wished him a safe journey and then continued her meal. Despite her husband's coldness, she was happy that they had spent the morning together and that they were about to travel together. The Imperial Palace was so magnificent and splendid that one could not look away. Jim arrived at the palace first and, as expected, bowed to the emperor. Amber followed him into the palace. Being in the emperor's palace made her feel constrained. Emperor Karl Vane and Empress Emily Vane greeted the Duke and his wife very warmly. To maintain social conversation and out of courtesy, the Duke inquired about the emperor's health. After briefly answering Jim's question, Karl turned to Amber, saying he hadn't been able to see her since the wedding. Amber thanked the emperor for everything he had done for her happiness. Karl was very pleased with Amber's words, as he knew how difficult it was to get along with and accept his temperamental nephew. Jim felt very uncomfortable listening to everything the emperor said, but he couldn't say anything because he was his uncle. Amber liked Karl. He was more concerned about her and more polite than her husband. However, a sliver of doubt about his kindness still arose in her heart. And so, the emperor and empress left the young couple alone. At night, the palace looked even more majestic, but also held a hint of mystery. Jim and Amber, freshened up, entered the dining room, and although they were husband and wife, a huge chasm separated them. Also at the table were the emperor's children, Jax and Alexandria. They were younger than Jim, but carried themselves with considerable dignity. Jim, as always, was silent. He hoped this dinner would end quickly. Despite his nephew's behavior, the emperor was in a good mood, and after a little wine, he thanked them for visiting the palace. Emily immediately echoed her husband's words, saying it was all thanks to Amber. Karl agreed, as he was glad his nephew had married the daughter of his loyal servant. The girl was flattered by the emperor's words, but when Karl started talking about children, Amber felt uneasy. The topic of children did not escape Jim's notice either. He was confused as to why his uncle was so concerned about this matter and began to raise his voice in the conversation. Jax and Alexandria had never heard Jim speak like this and were shocked by what was happening before them. The Duke's next words stunned everyone present. Jim proposed to annul his marriage to Amber, to hold back her tears and not let those around her see her emotions. Amber lowered her head and clenched her dress tightly in her fists. The Empress, however, noticed Amber's reaction and felt sorry for the poor girl. Emily immediately turned to Jim and asked him to stop this conversation, as such a joke had crossed all permissible boundaries. However, Karl defended his nephew, saying he had likely done nothing wrong. Jim, with undisguised sarcasm, retorted that he was, of course, misunderstood and had only wanted to show his loyalty to the emperor. The uncle understood his nephew's behavior, and both sat tensed, barely able to contain their emotions. Seeing the emperor's flushed face, the Duke was secretly pleased and made it clear that he understood what consequences His Highness's actions would lead to. The atmosphere at the royal dinner table was stretched to its limit, with only Amber feeling distraught by everything that was happening. She already regretted coming to the palace with the Duke. Then, to everyone's surprise, the rightful heir, Jax, shot up from his seat with a shout and turned to his father. Everyone at the table turned their attention to Jax, who, somewhat flustered, began to talk about the upcoming anniversary of the empire's founding. The next day, a small reception was held in the palace gardens, where high society had gathered. When Amber appeared in the garden, all the ladies began to compliment her, clearly wanting to befriend her. So much attention made her feel very uncomfortable, as she was always alone in the Duke's castle. A young lady asked Amber where she was living now so they could meet in the future, but she was no longer listening to them. The girl was lost in memories of the dinner with the Duke's relatives. She replayed Jim's words about ending the marriage over and over in her mind, each time convincing herself that he likely did not want this union. Completely lost in thought, Amber suddenly heard a voice that sent a chill down her spine. It was her mother, Anna, a stately woman with bright red hair and an unpleasant smile. The woman acted like a loving mother, which put Amber on high alert, as she knew her mother's true nature. While everyone was admiring the ostentatious mother-daughter relationship, Anna continued by asking her daughter how she was faring at the ducal residence. Amber was so bewildered by her mother's public behavior that she didn't notice everyone present was standing and watching them, as if expecting something. Anna gave her daughter no time to recover, chattering on, and suddenly began to say that she and Jim should come to visit them. But Amber didn't know how to convince her husband to return her family home with her, because not long ago, he had said he didn't want to see her. She also remembered the conversation about divorce at the emperor's table the previous night. She avoided her mother's gaze and said awkwardly that she would try to persuade the Duke to find time in his busy schedule. Hearing her words, Anna gripped her daughter's hand tightly, as if to imply she had no other choice. Despite the strength of her mother's grip on the surface, she still maintained that affable appearance. After pulling free from her mother's hand, Amber said she would go to her parents. Home alone, the girl remembered a time when she had a younger brother. From that moment on, no one paid her any attention. To her parents, she was a stain on their family. Anna would punish and mock her in every way possible for any transgression she thought Amber might have committed. One day, for speaking to a girl from a poor family, she locked her in a dark room with only a small window. That day, her mother showed her true face, one filled with hatred and rage. What Amber heard most often was not her name, but ungrateful brat, as a nickname. Even words of apology could not lessen her mother's loathing for her daughter. In her memories, the girl remembered that from their very first meeting, Anna had not acknowledged her as her own daughter. If Amber suffered failures and setbacks, her mother would only feel pleased. If her daughter made any mistake, her mother would not forget to restrict her food intake. Snapping out of her memories, Amber decided that even if her relationship with the Duke was already terrible, she would not quarrel with him over her parents. She gathered her courage, turned to her mother, and was about to speak when her mother cut her off. Anna feigned regret that the Duke could not come to visit them. The mother ignored her daughter's surprised expression and continued to ramble on, expressing her understanding of Amber's husband's busy schedule. The girl still didn't know how to answer her mother, who took the opportunity to ask her daughter to help her get a fan from the carriage. Anna grabbed Amber's arm and practically dragged her away. As was customary in high society, once the ladies had left, the women present began to gossip about them. The carriage was parked just by the road, so Amber and her mother had to walk a short distance. Reaching the carriage, Anna asked the girl to help her up. As Amber began to help, her mother seemed to accidentally kick her. She hadn't expected such a move from her mother, and she cried out in pain, shutting her eyes. The woman continued to bully her, saying it would be a pity if a scar were left on the girl's pretty face. But as soon as Anna saw a servant passing by, she transformed back into a loving mother, asking if Amber was hurt. As the girl tried to get up, her mother held out a hand to her, telling her to quickly take it. The daughter understood why her mother was pretending, because in everyone's eyes, she was the ideal wife of the Marquis and mother to her children. While Amber was pondering her mother's actions, the woman's face twisted with rage and with considerable malice. She told her daughter to hurry up and take her hand. Anna stood before her daughter, looking at her with contempt. The girl had nowhere to go and had no choice but to take her mother's hand. As soon as Amber was face to face with Anna, Anna threw the words at her, saying she had no choice but to bring Jim back to their home. The mother reminded her daughter that she must convincingly play the role assigned to her. After all, it was thanks to this role that she was still alive. After reminding Amber of her duty once more, Anna left. That evening, as the girl waited for Jim in his drawing room, she recalled the meeting with her mother, not knowing what to do. A servant broke the silence. Noticing the mistress's unease, he brought her a cup of chamomile tea. Amber took the tea, sipped it, and asked if he knew when the Duke would return. The servant, unable to give a precise answer as to when Jim would be back, took his leave. Amber began to wonder if her husband would be angry that she had come to see him. Lost in thought, the girl again remembered her mother's words that she had no choice, that she and the Duke had to go to her parents' house. Amber realized she was incredibly tired of this life. She wanted freedom and didn't want anyone else dictating the rules of her life. Before, she had felt that living in anticipation was normal, but today it had become a burden. At that moment, in the Crown Prince's office, Jim and Jax were talking. The topic of their conversation was the upcoming anniversary of the Empire's founding. The Duke asked the prince why he, and not the royal guard, was to guard the capital this time. Jax replied that he was entrusting the security to him because he trusted the Duke more than anyone, as he was also a member of the royal family, and he expected an affirmative answer. The Duke, in his usual manner, left without answering. Upon returning to his quarters, Jim passed by the servants and overheard them talking about his wife. The maid told the young manservant that the mistress had been pale during the day and that she had already told her to go to bed, but that perhaps she should call a doctor. The young manservant added that he had brought amber chamomile tea, for which the maid praised him. They continued their conversation, starting to joke around while carrying out their duties. But when they saw the Duke pass by, they began to greet him and bow. The Duke walked past them in silence, and the servants resumed their conversation. Jim entered his room, and as he began to undress, heard snoring. He turned toward the sound and saw Amber lying on the sofa. The Duke was surprised to see her in his room, as she had never been here before. It made him wonder what she was doing here. Amber muttered in her sleep, and Jim could only make out the word mama. He immediately recalled the servant's talk about the mistress being unwell and decided to attribute it all to the girl's physical condition. Despite the tension between them, he didn't wake her, but gently lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, as if she were someone he cherished. With a tenderness that felt unusual even to himself, the Duke placed Amber on the bed. After the day's emotional turmoil, the girl was sleeping so soundly that she didn't even wake up when Jim moved her from the sofa to the bed. For some reason, Jim couldn't leave right away. He stood by the bed for a while, watching his wife sleep. Instead of leaving the room himself, he stayed in case Amber woke up and needed something. After a moment, Jim heard a whisper. The girl was saying something almost inaudibly. Looking at Amber, he noticed she was still asleep and thought that perhaps she was talking nonsense due to her poor health. The girl suddenly woke up and sat up in bed, not yet fully understanding where she was. When she looked around and saw Jim sitting in a chair, she remembered that she had been waiting for him and had apparently fallen asleep. But the girl also remembered sitting on the sofa, yet she had woken up in bed. Could it really be that he had carried her over and placed her on the bed? As if reading her mind, the Duke said that the doctor had come and thought she had a cold. However, the girl didn't feel any symptoms of a cold. Most likely, her condition was caused by the meeting with her mother. She continued to sit on Jim's bed, looking around the room. On the bedside table was a glass of water and medicine. It seemed the Duke had called the doctor. Jim listened to her silently as Amber thanked him for his concern and took the medicine. Afterwards, the Duke asked his wife why she had come to his room. She didn't know where to begin to tell him about her mother's demand for them to come home. Jim began to grow impatient with the girl's behavior and told her to hurry up and tell him the reason for her presence in his room. She had just started to speak when she stopped short, mentioning that they were husband and wife. The Duke responded to this by saying that in that regard, Amber need not worry or be afraid of him. But she was still confused and decided it was best to leave for now. However, as Amber decided to get up and leave, Jim moved very close to her, leaned down, and placed his hands on either side of her body. He grabbed the bow on her dress, pulled it, and said, "Why don't we spend some time like a married couple right now?" Terrified, Amber told him to stop, but Jim had no intention of stopping. He continued to whisper in her ear about their physical closeness, about how they would share each other's warmth. Leaning over Amber, the Duke looked at her slyly and asked if this was what she wanted. In that moment, the girl was scared. She didn't know what to do or how to stop Jim. She just begged him to stop. Seeing the girl's fear, the Duke stood up and moved away from her. Amber said she had only come to talk and didn't want anything like that. Hearing these words, Jim was somewhat disappointed but continued to listen to the girl. Amber, covering herself with the front of her untied dress, asked if he could go with her to her parents' house, as her mother had requested. However, she then added that it was fine if he couldn't go and headed for the door. Jim was surprised by such a request, but what shocked him most was the girl saying she was trying to protect him. As Amber neared the door, she began to lose consciousness, and the next moment, she didn't understand how she had ended up in the Duke's arms. He caught her abruptly, yet with great warmth, and carried her back to the bed. After placing the girl on the bed, Jim said she should stay here and that he himself would go to another room. Amber didn't understand his concern and asked him why he was doing this, but the Duke replied that she could think whatever she wanted and then left the room. A maid was standing at the door of the room, and Jim ordered her to call the doctor for his wife again in the morning. Amber lay there, unable to believe everything that had just happened between them. He had called the doctor, caught her when she was about to fall. Although there was no love in his eyes when he looked at her, there was still a hint of tenderness and a flutter. She didn't know what the Duke was truly thinking, but she hoped that one day he would remember her as the little girl she once was. Amber closed her eyes and once again felt Jim's embrace, which was indeed very warm and comfortable. Meanwhile, the Duke took a bath and also thought of Amber. He recalled her words about protecting him and couldn't help but chuckle. How could she protect him when she herself had lost consciousness due to her poor health? The next morning, they traveled by carriage to Amber's parents' home. Amber was still surprised that the Duke would set aside his duties to accompany her. They sat facing each other, but Jim didn't want to look at her, preferring to turn his head and gaze out the window. Amber remembered a servant coming to tell her that morning that the Duke had finished his work and was ready to go with her to her parents' house. Just as she was wondering why he was doing this, Jim interrupted her thoughts by asking how she was feeling. The girl was happy about the Duke's concern and care, and she thanked him for it. The sun was shining brightly outside, and Amber thought that perhaps the weather was so clear and sunny. When they arrived at Amber's home, the Marquis came out to greet them. Morgan expressed his surprise that the Duke had taken time out of his busy schedule to meet with them. But Jim was not enthusiastic, and he replied curtly that the Marquis knew he was busy, yet still ordered him to come. The old Marquis ignored the Duke's words and suggested they have tea in the garden. While the tea was being prepared, Amber gave Jim a tour of the castle, showing him the paintings that the Marquis treasured greatly. The Duke, with his usual solemnity, walked past the paintings and examined them until they came to one particular painting. The portrait was of a young Amber, at the age when they had first met. The girl added that her mother disliked the painting because it was often hung up for show. Jim looked at the canvas in silence, not saying a word. As the Duke studied the painting, Amber watched him and decided to ask him a question. She didn't know how to begin, but she really wanted to know why he had done it. And just as she was about to speak, a servant came and interrupted them, announcing that the tea was ready. However, the Duke didn't miss her attempt to ask a question and asked her in return what she wanted to ask. But Amber had already changed her mind, saying it wasn't important now and that she would ask another time. The girl hurried out of the gallery, urging Jim to follow her to the garden. What she had wanted to ask remained a mystery to him. They arrived in the garden, where there were many statues and servants bustling about. The Marquis appeared at once and began to ask the Duke what he thought of the castle, to which Jim replied that there were too many paintings. Morgan began to praise his wife and how much she loved art. She especially praised the painting depicting her beloved daughter, Amber. Hearing these words, the word lies slipped from Amber's lips, but fortunately, no one heard. As soon as her father noticed his daughter, he used the excuse of having bought her many jewels and dresses to ask her to leave with him for a moment. He left his courtiers with the Duke, so he wouldn't be bored, and suggested he study a proposal on city business. Morgan led his daughter down a path deeper into the garden and began to ask about the Duke and whether he was behaving too strangely. The father emphasized the phrase behaving strangely, as he was worried that Jim had someone else on the side. Amber didn't know how to answer, as the Duke was always busy, and all she knew was that he was always handling his duties. The father, dissatisfied with his daughter's answer, began to press her, asking what she had been doing in the Duke's residence and whether she had given him the medicine she brought to use. The girl decided to pretend she had completely forgotten about the medicine. Hearing his daughter say this, the father went mad with anger. The father gave Amber no chance to speak, threatening that if the marriage with the Duke failed, she would no longer be his daughter, and said that if she didn't want to be abandoned like her mother and rot in solitude, she must bear Jim a child. But what struck the girl the most were the Marquis's words that if she couldn't do it, she should use the potion and take him by force. Morgan didn't listen to his daughter at all, simply telling her to obey him and do as he said. Amber couldn't bear to listen to her father's lecture about seducing the Duke and using the potion any longer. After saying everything he wanted to say, the Marquis told his daughter to leave so that Jim would become suspicious. Amber desperately fled from her crazed father, with only one thought in her mind: to get rid of the potion as soon as possible. As her father watched his daughter leave, he called over a courtier. He ordered his servant to fetch the potion and give it to Amber, but not to let the Duke find out. However, the Marquis didn't notice that the Duke's advisor was standing behind the bushes and heard everything. Soon, Jim and Amber returned to their castle and went about their own business. The girl went straight back to her room and started searching for the potion, but she couldn't find it anywhere. She asked her servants if they had found the bottle, but the servants were only worried that they might be blamed for their mistress's missing item. One of them began to make excuses, saying that no maid would dare take anything from Amber's room. Just then, Jim appeared in the room with a strange smile, asking if they had lost something. The girl was very surprised by her husband's appearance, as he had never visited her before, and upon his return, he had said he had much to do. Amber was so surprised she stammered, unable to say a word. But then, The Duke produced the bottle right before her eyes. At that moment, Amber felt the ground disappear from under her feet. She couldn't understand how the potion had ended up in the Duke's hands. With the same smile, he asked if she wanted to tell him where she got this bottle containing drugs and an aphrodisiac and what she intended to do with it. The girl couldn't answer. She was both scared and confused, and the Duke continued to press her. He accused her of putting on an act, that behind her sweet face was actually a terrible and calculating soul. But the first time the Duke felt something for her was the day he found her in his room. He had watched her for a long time as she slept, listening to her mumble in her sleep. Jim remembered that she slept for a long time without waking, groaning in her sleep as if having a terrible dream, and only woke up after a good while. She had called out to the Duke through her sleepy eyes, and that pure, innocent look still floated before his eyes. She reminded him of the old Marquis, but at the same time, she was so different from him in many ways. The Duke remembered how scared she was, how her fragile body trembled, the moment he decided to rudely find out the reason for her presence. At that moment, watching her struggle to recover from the shock, he even felt guilty for his actions. He also couldn't understand what she wanted to protect him from, and in general, how such a crystal pure girl could protect anyone. Despite the tension between them, it was in her that Jim felt pity, guilt, and confusion all at once, which greatly unsettled him. On the day of their visit to Amber's parents, the Duke met with his advisor, who had accidentally overheard the conversation between the father and daughter. The advisor had recorded part of their conversation and handed the transcript to Jim. After reading the transcript, Jim was very surprised that his wife could be so calculating. The advisor also expressed his opinion that the Duchess was like a beautiful flower with thorns, and it was best not to trust her. Otherwise, one day she would turn the tip of her knife on him. After saying this, Jim left, while the advisor remained at Amber's parents' castle. Jim, as usual, returned to his own residence first and found the bottle in Amber's room. He was shocked after showing the bottle to a local doctor. It was an aphrodisiac. The doctor also found something more. The bottle also contained a narcotic component, which made the potion very dangerous. As the Duke was told, such vials were circulated among some nobles and were very difficult to obtain. Jim even laughed for a moment at his own weakness for trying to believe the girl. His thoughts were interrupted by Amber, who was still incoherently explaining something. But Jim no longer cared about her words. He had torn off her mask, and the slight feeling he had for her was gone, which made him feel much better. The girl couldn't let the Duke just leave. She ran after him, trying to stop him. Blinded by tears, she tripped on her dress while running and almost fell. She pleaded with Jim to believe that she had no intention of using the potion and that she had rushed into the room to throw it away. But the Duke cut her off. He was no longer interested in her excuses, and his slight interest in her had vanished. Moreover, from this moment on, he had no reason to respect her anymore. Jim's final words caught Amber off guard, and she completely lost hope of convincing him. Left alone again, she couldn't move. All she could do was stand there and cry at the closed door. Amber remembered the first time the Duke appeared in her life, how in her eyes he had been the hope for a better life. The Duchess mumbled some inaudible words and fainted by the door through which the Duke had disappeared. A servant ran to help her, trying to wake Amber up, but the girl didn't move. She continued to mumble as if delirious. The Duke was already far from the door where he had left Amber, but he could still hear the servant's shouts. The next day, the girl sat on the stairs, recalling the morning's events and the Duke's words. She looked at her hands, as if she could still feel the touch of his hands when she had tried to stop him. After her deception, the Duke didn't want to see her, let alone speak to her. But Amber still wouldn't calm down. She begged him to talk to her, as she had something important to tell him. The Duke shook her hand off for the last time and said rudely that he no longer intended to respect her and that she had better stay in her bedroom. Deeply hurt by the Duke's words, Amber couldn't move from her spot, and useless tears streamed down her cheeks. But she still tried to calm herself, convincing herself that tears would not help in this situation. The girl decided that instead of crying, she should do something useful. She hoped that this way, the Duke would appreciate her actions and allow them to talk. Amber believed that Jim was kind-hearted, which was why he had worried about her and taken care of her when she was sick. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the words of a nearby maid, who said that perhaps he had a lover on the side. Another maid added that he couldn't stand Lady Amber, which was why he didn't want to come home. The maids continued to gossip about the Duke and his wife, not noticing her as she walked past them. Amber was shocked that everyone in the residence saw her as some kind of evil being. She couldn't take it anymore and ran desperately back to her room, holding back her tears. As she ran, the maid's cruel words echoed in her mind, saying it would have been better if she had never appeared in the Duke's life. The next morning, Amber sat in front of the mirror as her personal maid, Lindsay, braided her hair. The girl decided to ask Lindsay if she knew when Jim would be back, or if he would come back at all. Lindsay tried her best to reassure her mistress, saying that the Duke had been late like this before, or had returned very late. To distract Amber from her sad thoughts, she asked about the girl's plans for the day. Amber said she planned to go to the library to read, but Lindsay suggested they go to the market instead and buy something. After thinking for a moment, the girl finally agreed to go out for a walk and temporarily forget her current situation. Meanwhile, Jim and his assistant, Luke, were talking about smuggling investigation. Luke reported on the progress of the case and their suspects. Jim was concerned about both the deal itself and the participants, so he asked his aide to speed things up. Furthermore, it was well known that a large organization was conducting deals in the red light district. Amber's father, Marquis Morgan Aloys, was also involved, and the Duke wanted to catch and punish him. Luke understood the Duke's intentions, but reminded him that the smugglers were well hidden. However, he would do his best. Jim was prepared to go to any length to catch Morgan Aloys and the mastermind behind him in the act. The aide silently accepted all of the Duke's instructions and bowed in respect. However, he still expressed his confusion, thinking that the Marquis would be a complete fool to risk exposing himself like this. After all, he must understand that if you play the role of a pawn, you'll be sacrificed sooner or later. Jim gave Luke a few more instructions and told him to leave, but the aide was in no hurry to go. The Duke looked at him quizzically, as if waiting for a question. Luke hesitated, then asked if the Duke wanted to assign some guards to the Duchess, lest Amber harm the Duke, since she was, after all, raised by the Marquis for many years. Luke's words enraged Jim, who ordered him to get out. The aide was startled by the Duke's tone and asked again, but it was futile, as Jim was even more furious than before. Luke said no more, simply bowed, and started to leave the office. As he reached the door, he remembered that he had not yet reported to the Duke about the disturbances in his territory. Jim didn't answer, merely looking at his aide with a puzzled expression. Amber and Lindsay were browsing the local market when a strange man accidentally bumped into them. The next moment, Amber saw another man grab her maid from behind and cover her mouth. The Duchess was about to scream for help, but the man who had bumped into them told her to be quiet and come with him if she didn't want her maid to get hurt. But Amber screamed for them to let Lindsay go, and the man then covered her mouth with his hand. In a harsher tone, he ordered her to remain silent if she didn't want to get hurt. Amber tried to calm herself down, remembering her childhood and a bouquet of lilies of the valley. Her birth mother had promised to make her a bouquet of lilies of the valley for her wedding. That was why they had come to the part of the market that sold these lilies of the valley. The maid noticed this and asked if she liked the flowers and wanted to buy them. Amber bought a bouquet of lilies of the valley without hesitation, and her mood improved considerably. After shopping, Lindsay suggested the Duchess find a place to get something to eat. As they walked past the market stalls, the maid suggested they should hire a porter, as they had bought many things. It was at that moment that the unidentified men appeared in their path. One of them seemed to accidentally push Lindsay's shoulder, causing her to drop the bag of stationery she was holding and fall to her knees. Amber immediately bent down to see if she was all right. Lindsay was very worried about the dropped food, and Amber had to comfort her. Then she heard the man's mocking tone. The man approached them, looking down at them like a hawk eyeing its prey. At this moment, Jim and Luke were passing by the market. The Duke caught a glimpse of something amiss out of the corner of his eye and stopped paying close attention to his aide's report on the atmosphere in the territory and the situation with the monsters on the border. Luke noticed Jim wasn't listening to him, looked in the same direction, and asked, "What's happening over there?" Jim noticed stationery scattered on the ground from a bag, which was strange. However, he pushed these thoughts aside, returned to Luke's side, and they continued on their way, talking as they went. Meanwhile, Amber and Lindsay were being held captive by thugs in a market alley. Amber tried to break free, but couldn't. The man's grip was too tight. The next minute, she felt someone push her captor from behind. He fell, causing her to fall with him. The blow knocked the man to the ground, his head hitting the pavement, and the Duchess heard the sound of a sword. The man, enraged by the blow, cursed and began to turn to see who had attacked him. Amber also looked up and felt a pleasant surprise when she saw her husband standing. before her. Jim looked at her with sadness and anger and asked what she was doing here. After all, he had already warned her once to stay in her room and not to leave the palace. Amber tried to explain to the Duke, but didn't know where to start. She seemed terrified and had forgotten all her words. She suddenly realized that she had severely sprained her ankle when she fell. Before she could even think, Jim came to her side and picked her up, leaving her even more speechless. A moment later, the Duke's aide, Luke, appeared, and Jim ordered him to arrange for a carriage. He carried Amber to the carriage, placed her inside, and then, uncharacteristically, asked if she was all right. After receiving an affirmative answer from the girl, he turned to the maid and ordered her to return to the palace immediately. Amber understood that if she didn't speak to the Duke now, she didn't know when she would get another chance. While Jim was giving instructions to the maid, the girl was thinking about how to start a conversation so that he wouldn't push her away again. Finally, she asked him if the reason he hadn't returned to the palace for so long was because of her. After all, she felt guilty about the aphrodisiac incident, even though she hadn't intended to use it on the Duke. However, Jim didn't believe her this time either and stated again that he hadn't been wrong about her and didn't trust her words. Amber looked at him with such clear eyes, a look that showed her complete bewilderment at the current situation. This look greatly irritated Jim, and he revealed a secret. From the very beginning, he had never wanted to marry her. These words deeply hurt Amber. She sat in the carriage, not understanding why he would do this. But she still gathered her courage and told him that she liked him, and had liked him from the very beginning. She remembered their first meeting again, how he had brought her out of the dark room, and how they had sat on the balcony. However, the Duke's words that she was mistaken pulled her back to reality. Jim walked away, adding that her feelings were useless to him. Amber was once again left alone, hurt by her husband's words. A few days later, Amber went to the Empress's palace for the Foundation Day celebration. In the hall, she met the Empress and her daughter, who seemed happy to see her. But they immediately asked about the Duke, catching the Duchess off guard. She gathered her thoughts and said that he was very busy, so she had arrived first on her own. She also told them that he hadn't been seen at the palace since her last visit, which surprised the Empress and her daughter. However, she almost immediately tried to make excuses for him, saying it was all because of the monster disturbances on the border. The Empress was very kind to Amber and immediately supported her, saying it would be good for her to spend more time with her female friends. Alexandria also welcomed her warmly and poured her tea. While drinking tea, Amber showed concern for the Emperor's daughter, asking about her health, as she had been feeling a bit unwell in the morning. Alexandria assured her that she was fine now, but she couldn't say the same for Amber. These words made the Duchess feel awkward. She didn't know how to respond, but fortunately, the Empress Emily entered the room. Emily invited them to attend the evening mass, if they didn't mind. As she was leaving, she added that there would be a priest there to pray for expectant mothers, giving Amber a meaningful look. After entering the temple, the Duchess saw a priest standing with a holy grail, giving a speech that warmed her heart. Amber got in line to see the priest, but still wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing. But when the priest looked at her, she seemed to feel something and no longer doubted the correctness of her decision. The Duchess approached him and knelt, and at that moment, the priest dipped his hand into a basin full of holy water. He touched her head with his hand and began to bless her. Amber remained kneeling in prayer, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Seeing this, the priest decided to ask the girl why she was crying. She looked up at him but couldn't say a word, as she didn't know how to explain what had happened between her and the Duke. When the priest saw Amber's face from under her veil, he recognized her and asked in return if she recognized him too, but he was a stranger to her, as she had never seen him before. After blessing the Duchess, the priest let her go and began to speak with the other girls. As she left, Amber looked back at the priest again, hoping to remember him. The Foundation Day celebration arrived, and the first to greet them was the Emperor's son, Jax. He, of course, made a sarcastic joke about the Duke's absence from the military parade, thinking he wouldn't show up for the celebration either. But the Duke countered his words. With a hint of forced friendliness, Jim said that he couldn't miss this festival. Just then, someone brought them drinks, and the Duke, to relax a bit, picked up a glass of wine. After taking a small sip, he grinned and added that he couldn't miss a festival that was so important to him. Jax ignored the Duke's sarcasm, announced that the ball was about to begin, and invited his sister to dance. Alexandria happily agreed, as she loved to dance. Jax took his sister's hand and led her to the center of the huge ballroom. Amber was captivated by the siblings' dance and wanted to dance too. She decided to call out to the Duke, but he was engrossed in conversation with someone else and didn't hear her. She tried calling him again, but realized it was futile. Amber felt lonely again. She stood there, just watching the dancing couples who were in stark contrast to her. The Duke retreated from the ball to be alone on the balcony, as he was very tired of the crowd, but he was only alone for a short time. Amber appeared from behind the door. She had brought him tea, which would help warm him up and sober him from the lingering effects of the wine. Jim didn't even turn towards her, once again making his attitude clear. Amber carefully held the teacup to avoid spilling it. As she approached him and placed the cup in front of the Duke, she said that he didn't have to drink it if he didn't want to. Jim was most annoyed by this kind of concern from Amber. He didn't want to accept any form of care. The Duchess felt all his anger and hatred. She lowered her head, trembling, whether from emotion or from the cold. The girl's childlike and naive appearance made Jim even angrier, but he also saw the pain in her eyes that he had caused. However, he didn't want to believe her. She had already deceived him once with that same innocent look. Then he asked about their marriage. Did she really think this marriage would last forever? Amber was frightened by the question. She was truly afraid of losing the Duke. But Jim didn't ask this question for no reason. He hoped that this way she would understand everything and stop bothering him with her presence. The girl had nothing to say to her husband. She realized that nothing could improve their relationship. After apologizing, Amber bowed and decided to leave. As she was leaving, she paused and told Jim that she wouldn't bother him anymore. She closed the door behind her, leaving him alone with his thoughts. After Amber left, the Duke couldn't understand why her words affected him so much, why he couldn't stop thinking about her when he clearly didn't like her. After standing for a moment, he decided to leave, but heard someone's footsteps. A red-haired girl came out from around the corner, saying she had accidentally overheard their conversation. The Duke, not liking that someone had witnessed their conversation, asked the stranger who she was. The girl introduced herself as Missy, the daughter of Duke Ephraim. Before the Duke could respond, she continued, saying that she could see that Jim. He hated his wife. The Duke wanted to push her away, but Missy was persistent and immediately asked if he wanted to form an alliance with her family. Meanwhile, Amber was walking down the hallway, pondering what she should do now. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice when she tripped and twisted her ankle. She stopped, lifted the hem of her dress, and inspected the damage from the unfortunate incident. Just as she was examining her leg, she suddenly heard footsteps behind her and thought it was the Duke. Amber was very surprised to see the priest in front of her. Despite the Duke's silence, Missy relentlessly pressed him about whether he was willing to form a marriage alliance with her family. At one point, she realized he didn't remember her, which disappointed her, as they had discussed a possible marriage contract in their childhood. Jim was shocked by this shameless behavior and sarcastically asked if the girl had damaged her brain as a child to be asking a strange man such a question. The Duke's words seemed to offend Missy, and she was about to speak again, but the Duke had already brushed past her. Without another word, Jim decided to leave, leaving the strange woman behind. He returned to the ballroom to look for Amber. He scanned the room for her with his eyes, but couldn't find her, and he began to grow annoyed. Her figure, her voice, her beautiful hair all appeared in his mind. It was as if he could hear her attentively offering him a cup of tea. Snapping back to reality, he banished the thoughts of her from his mind, thinking that this girl was about to drive him mad. At this moment, Amber was still in the hallway with the priest. He noticed her injured ankle and offered to help. Before Amber could speak, the priest bent down, moving closer to her leg to get a better look. He took hold of the girl's leg, began to mutter something under his breath, and then said he was skilled at healing with the help of divine power. After casting the spell for another moment, he released Amber's leg and stood up. The Duchess carefully put her leg down and tried to put weight on it. To her surprise, the pain was completely gone. The priest said he was glad to have been of help and bid Amber farewell, preparing to leave when she decided to ask if they had met before. The girl's question made him very happy, as if he had been waiting for her to ask it. The Duchess didn't understand what the priest was happy about, and then the priest revealed the secret, saying he had met her when she was just a baby, which was why she didn't remember him. The girl was surprised that he still remembered her. The priest added that he was only 15 when he met her. He looked so young now because he used divine power. Everything the priest said left Amber stunned. She couldn't believe he was now 37 years old. As she marveled at his appearance, he stood there watching her, as if waiting for the most crucial question. In that very moment, it dawned on her. If he had met her when she was a baby, then he must have known her birth mother. But the priest didn't give her the chance to ask, as he had to leave, seemingly not wanting to be seen there. Unable to ask the question on her mind, Amber fell silent and pensive again. Seeing this, the priest paused for a moment and encouraged her, saying that she was very important to him and that they would meet again soon. His words seemed to give the girl wings, and all her sorrow seemed to be swept away by a wind of change. Soon, the priest left, leaving her immersed in this feeling. After some time, another letter arrived from Amber's father, but she didn't open it, as she felt it contained more instructions about having a child and seducing the Duke. She was once again overcome with loneliness, unable to understand how her father could make such a demand of her. Sitting on the windowsill, she thought that if she were pregnant, Jim would be happy about the child. However, he didn't even come to see her and was often nowhere to be found, just like now. So how could they even talk about a child? Amber was about to order someone to burn her father's letter, but she remembered that her maid, Lindsay, had the day off. Realizing she had no one to confide in, she decided to go to her favorite place, the library. On her way from the bedroom to the library, she passed servants who bowed to her. But after she walked past them, she heard them discussing the potion her father had sent. She was furious with her father. Because of him, she once again felt insignificant. But Amber pulled herself together, deciding not to dwell on it, and instead distract herself by reading her favorite books. The library was her favorite place. Here, she could be herself and didn't feel so lonely. After she finished reading and closed the book, she noticed she was starting to feel cold. She wrapped her arms around herself and walked toward the library exit. Amber pulled hard on the doorknob, but the door was locked, even though she hadn't locked it herself. The girl remembered there were several maids in the hallway when she arrived, but surely they wouldn't have locked her in. She started knocking on the door and calling for help, but only dead silence answered her. At this moment, as Amber desperately called for help, no one heard her. The hallway outside the library was empty. The Duchess pressed her body against the door, trying to hear even the slightest sound from outside, but she heard nothing. Nothing at all. She used what little strength she had left to keep knocking, but the cold was continuously draining her energy. With every movement, a bit more of her strength slipped away, until finally, she could no longer move. She leaned her back against the door, unable to understand why she had been locked in. The maid she had seen on her way here often gossiped about her and the Duke, not understanding why he kept her here. Could everyone in this mansion truly be so full of contempt and hatred for her? However, Amber thought of the Duke, thinking he would surely notice she was missing, provided, of course, that he came home. After that, everything became a blur. She couldn't tell if it was a dream or reality, but Jim really did find her. Amber felt as if she had fallen into a dream. One moment, she seemed to be walking arm in arm with the Duke, but the next, she was alone again in a cold room. In the distance, she could faintly hear the voices of Jim and another man, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Amber closed her eyes in frustration, convinced it was just another dream. When she opened her eyes, the Duke was approaching her, asking with concern how she felt. Amber was surprised that Jim was right there beside her. He told her that he had found her in the library and, with Lindsay's help, had discovered that the other maids had deliberately locked her in. The Duke moved a chair closer to Amber's bed and asked her what she wanted to do with those who had wronged her. He was willing to do anything to punish them for the harm they had caused Amber, but she didn't want to punish them at all. She was too tired. Jim was confused why she would decide to just let it go when she had been intentionally locked in the library and nearly frozen to death. To this, the Duchess simply replied that he had gotten what he had always longed for. The Duke didn't understand the girl's words and asked her again what she meant. Amber used the last of her strength to tell him that this was exactly what he had always wanted, for her to disappear and no longer interfere in his life. He should be grateful for what the maids had done. Jim ignored the girl's words and told her to eat and take her medicine. As he handed her a bowl of soup, their hands brushed lightly. The contact sent a flicker of warmth through the Duke, though he still didn't understand why this happened around her. Amber broke the silence with a question about their marriage and the Duke's behavior. She didn't understand why he acted the way he did. Jim listened to her in silence, making sure she finished her soup and took the necessary medicine. The girl desperately wanted answers to the questions that had been tormenting her, so she stopped eating and looked at Jim. The Duke stood up from his chair and told her that he was still considering ending the marriage and that her feelings meant nothing to him. However, one thing continued to bother him, the feeling of powerlessness he felt around her. He placed the medicine and the plate with the remaining soup on the nightstand and waited for Amber to fall asleep. The girl fell asleep quickly, whether from exhaustion or because of the soup and medicine. Before leaving, Jim glanced one more time at the sleeping Amber, and after confirming she was asleep, he left the room. As soon as he stepped out of the girl's room, he called for his assistant, who was nearby. Jim ordered him to gather all the maids who had locked Amber in, take them to the basement for punishment, and then throw them out. Luke received all the instructions, bowed, and went to find the maids. Jim was furious at the maids' actions and was determined to punish them severely. He left Amber's room and walked down the long hallway, endlessly cursing the culprits. A few days later, Amber was feeling much better and went down to the dining hall for breakfast. The Duke was already there, sitting and working on documents as usual, oblivious to everything happening around him. As Amber walked down to the dining hall, she noticed that the new maids were very respectful toward her. They bowed to her, greeted her, and didn't whisper behind her back at all. According to her maid Lindsay, all those maids had been punished and expelled from the palace on the Duke's orders. However, the Duke's behavior hadn't changed in the slightest. He ignored her just as before. Amber was not happy that he had punished them anyway, despite her asking him not to. She blamed herself for reminding him of her existence again and causing him so much trouble. After waiting a moment, the Duchess decided to ask Jim how he was feeling. He looked up at her quizzically, and she replied that he looked tired. The Duke, as always, remained silent and continued to study his documents. Even sitting at the same table, they were worlds apart, and Amber could feel it. She began to eat her breakfast, pretending that Jim's silence didn't bother her. The Duke was carefully studying the documents his assistant had brought him that morning. Just then, the Duchess addressed him again in her guilt-ridden voice, which annoyed him. Jim looked at her with tired eyes, anticipating another tiresome conversation. Amber gathered all her courage and asked him when he planned to divorce her. The question stunned him, and he sarcastically asked if she was in a hurry to get back to her father. Confused by the Duke's attack, Amber tried to defend herself. However, the Duke had no intention of believing her, and he once again implied that he had no trust in her and never would. The Duchess already knew how Jim felt about her, but his words still hurt her deeply. In front of him was his father's daughter, an equally vile traitor. Jim reminded her that she had tried to seduce him with a potion and that nothing could change his attitude toward her. The Duke did everything he could to make her understand that she had nothing to hope for and should stop trying. Realizing she was about to cry, Amber lowered her head, said she was sorry, and left the dining hall. Jim was glad to finally be alone and able to attend to his affairs in peace. Amber called her maid and practically fled from the dining hall. But for some reason, as the Duke watched the girls retreating back, he felt a pang of sadness. The next day was sunny and seemed unusually magical for some reason. Amber stayed in her room, waiting for her maid to come and help her get ready. When Lindsay appeared, the Duchess noticed she was holding a bouquet of flowers. Lindsay had brought a new bouquet of lilies of the valley to replace the old, withered one. She placed the flowers in a vase and showed them to Amber, but Amber just sat sadly, showing no reaction to the bouquet. When a maid asked where to put the vase, the girl listlessly pointed to the table. Lindsay tried her best to pull her mistress from her sad thoughts, suggesting a walk in the garden. Amber couldn't be bothered to move, but she still agreed to a walk in the garden. The maid chattered on, trying to distract Amber, but she was lost in her own thoughts. The Duchess, lost in thought, heard Lindsay suggest she tend to the garden to forget her current troubles. But Amber simply replied that the butler would handle it, and that she wasn't sure if she would even be here until spring. Suddenly, several maids came around the corner and, upon seeing the Duchess, immediately began to curtsy. They didn't raise their heads until Amber had passed, which made her very sad. She didn't want them to be afraid of her. As they passed the maids, Lindsay told her that they were close to the people who had locked her in the study. Amber just sighed heavily and continued walking. Her maid called after her, but Amber decided to ignore her and walk on alone. Amber no longer wanted to do anything or feel anything. She understood that there was no place for her in this house. Just then, a strange man was seen walking towards the ducal estate, clearly in a hurry. The stranger turned out to be a priest who had attended the National Foundation celebration. He walked swiftly towards the ducal estate, seeming to want to see someone as quickly as possible, while also trying to avoid being noticed. Amber was already back at her room. A maid was arranging her hair. A servant entered the room to announce that the Duchess had a visitor. She was surprised and couldn't imagine who it could be. But deep down, she hoped it wasn't her father. As she walked into the drawing room, she was still guessing who the visitor might be, only to be pleasantly surprised. Standing before her was the very priest she had met at the National Foundation celebration. He had come to see her because he was very worried about her and wanted to talk. He also relayed that Princess Alexandria was worried about her as well. Hearing this, Amber was happy, as she had completely forgotten what it felt like to be worried about. After a bit more talk about the royal family, the priest noticed the sadness in Amber's eyes. To find out the reason, he asked if he could see the Duke, but the girl, as if reciting from script, replied that he was not at the estate. He was, as always, busy with his own affairs. The priest remained silent, but seemed to understand everything. The Duchess, like a true hostess, invited him to sit down for tea. After they sat on the sofa, Amber expressed her gratitude to the priest for coming to see her. In response, she received the same sentiment in return, along with a question about why she was so sad. The priest said that her sadness disturbed him. Amber was surprised. No one had ever spoken to her so gently and caringly, let alone worried about her. To put the girl at ease, the priest said that she looked very much like her birth mother, and that when Amber was born, he was there. He held out his hand to her, gesturing for her to take it. Amber cautiously extended her hand to the priest, and when their hands touched, something magical happened. Light poured out from their hands, filling the entire drawing room and growing brighter and brighter. In that moment, Amber's soul and heart felt a warmth and peace. As never before, the priest smiled warmly and reminded her that he could heal others with his divine power. He also told her that she was the first person he had saved before God granted him his divine power. Her mother had asked him to deliver her, and the first blessing of his life was for the baby to become the happiest person in the world. Amber released the priest's hand, and he asked if she was happy now. She placed her hand on her chest and just looked at the priest. The girl didn't know how to answer him. The priest noticed this and said that if she wasn't happy, then it was his fault. The next moment, he began to pull something out of his pocket, saying he had wanted to give it to her for a long time. In the box was a pendant containing his divine power. He said that Amber was special to him and that he wanted her to have the pendant. The priest placed the pendant in her hand, and she immediately felt the warmth radiating from it. Amber was astonished. This was the first time someone had entrusted something so precious to her. The priest said that he hoped she would be peaceful and happy, and that this pendant would help her achieve that. The Duchess clutched the pendant to her chest, thanked the priest, and truly felt warmth and peace in her heart. The priest was about to say something more, but before he could, the Duke walked into the drawing room. Jim was surprised to see a priest in his own home, especially with Amber. As the Duke approached them, the priest introduced himself. His name was Thomas. However, despite Thomas's friendly demeanor, Jim remained cold and immediately questioned why he was here. The priest, with his usual kindness, replied that he had been sent by Princess Alexandria, who was concerned about Amber's well-being and had asked him to visit. The Duke did not appreciate Alexandria's gesture. He had always been a stranger to anyone's concern. Amber tried to appear confident and not show her emotions. She then offered to show Thomas to a room where he could rest after dinner. From that day on, the priest stayed at the ducal estate for a while and blessed every room. Amber was grateful for his presence. Although it was for a short time, he made her feel much better. The weather grew colder by the day, and Lindsay suggested calling a tailor to take her measurements for some warm clothes. The maid noticed that the Duchess's complexion and spirits were much improved. Amber noticed the butler nearby, with another person beside him. By the time they approached, the person had already left, and the butler looked somewhat perplexed. He said that a letter had arrived from Marquis Eloise. Amber's expression immediately darkened. She understood what kind of letter it was. More instructions from her father. She held out her hand to the butler, asking for the letter so she could write a reply immediately. But the butler said the letter was addressed to the Duke. This took Amber by surprise. She had to find out what her father was plotting now. She insistently held out her hand for the letter again, saying she would deliver it to the Duke personally. The butler was hesitant, and to be more persuasive, Amber put on the air of a true mistress of the house and demanded the letter in a commanding tone. The butler had no choice but to hand her the letter. After taking it from his hand, she asked him if he knew where the Duke was now. She was surprised when the butler said that Jim had his own country villa, as Amber knew nothing about it. She called for a carriage and headed to the Duke's country villa. On the way, she thought a lot about the Duke's true feelings, what he really wanted from her, and why he hid so much from her. While Amber was driving to the country villa, Jim was in conversation with Duke Ephraim and his daughter, Missy. Duke Ephraim was suggesting that the Duke divorce Amber and was persuading him that it would be more advantageous to marry his own daughter. Jim listened intently without interrupting, calculating in his mind what this Ephraim really wanted from him. Amber had arrived at the country villa and was walking confidently towards the entrance. As she walked down the path, she thought that this must be where the Duke handled matters of state. As she approached the door, a woman with vibrant red hair came out to meet her. They nearly collided at the doorway, and both apologized, not yet knowing who the other was. Amber felt uneasy around this stranger and wanted to find the Duke as soon as possible. But the girl was in no hurry to let her in and asked if Amber was the Duke's wife. The Duchess, equally awkwardly, replied that she was indeed the Duke's wife and began to wonder if she had seen this person before. The girl introduced herself as Missy, Duke Ephraim's daughter, and with some impertinence, asked what Amber was doing here. She was shocked at the audacity of her daring to speak to the Duchess in such a way. Amber summoned all her inner strength and said that this was the residence of His Grace, the Grand Duke, and questioned what she was doing here. Missy, refusing to back down, replied with the same arrogance that they were here to see the Duke and discuss some matters. Moreover, Duke Ephraim's daughter had no intention of letting Amber into the house, explaining that the Duke was currently in an important conversation with her father. Missy continued to taunt, saying she knew that Jim was considering an annulment of his marriage to the Grand Duchess. Amber was struck dumb by the attack from this girl she didn't even know. But she wasn't about to stop there, and even suggested that the Duchess prepare for the divorce and perhaps find someone to replace the Duke. Missy stepped up to the Duchess and looked her in the eye with the authoritative gaze of a victor. The Duchess began to recall her maid's words about the Duke possibly having a mistress. Could this girl really be his lover? The thought terrified her, and she clutched the pendant. After this unpleasant conversation, Amber decided not to look for Jim and instead return to the ducal estate. Just then, the conversation between Duke Ephraim and Jim ended, and they went their separate ways. The Duke's assistant, Luke, immediately headed towards his office. As he passed Ephraim, he heard him cursing Jim. Luke noted that Duke Ephraim was clearly dissatisfied with his conversation with His Grace, and he made a note of the words directed at Jim, just in case. When he entered the office, he immediately asked why the Duke had refused Ephraim's offer. Jim sat there and thought and did not answer him right away. An hour ago, Duke Ephraim and his daughter Missy had come to see him. They had requested a meeting, supposedly for something very important. The proposal was to annul his current marriage and marry his daughter instead. In doing so, Jim would gain his benefits and finally be free from the royal family's grasp. Ephraim tried to convince the Duke that the Emperor was not acting in his best interests, as he had spent his entire youth fighting for the Empire. He had also been forced, against his will, to marry the daughter of a Marquis loyal to him. And now the Duke had the chance to end this marriage. Wasn't that exactly what he wanted? Jim listened to it all, but with his usual cold smile, asked Ephraim why he would think he wanted to end this marriage. Ephraim didn't immediately understand the Duke's tone, and so he hinted that it was just the two of them here, and there was no need to pretend. He also added that his daughter had recently heard that you wanted to end your marriage with the current Duchess. This conversation began to annoy Jim, and he expressed his displeasure with Missy, comparing her to a scurrying mouse. Missy was not entirely pleased with this comparison, but Ephraim paid it no mind. For the sake of his daughter's marriage, he was prepared to indulge the Duke in anything. Ephraim mentioned again that the possibility of marrying his daughter would be a good opportunity to break free from the Emperor's grasp. Jim did not want to respond to Duke Ephraim's persuasion, but he wouldn't let up, suggesting they incriminate the Duchess and find some dirt on her. Jim began to get tired of Ephraim's words and started to get angry. The Duke continued to boast about his family and compare it to the Marquis' family. Jim couldn't stand it any longer, called the conversation tiresome, and concluded that Ephraim was just trying to push his daughter on him. He didn't understand how his current marriage was any different from what was being offered to him. Ephraim tried to persuade the Duke, but he had little success. Jim recalled his conversation with Amber during their recent breakfast, when she had asked him when he planned to divorce her. She was so naive and sad in that moment. But at the same time, an alliance with the Ephraim family was not a bad idea, but the Duke still didn't want it. So Jim announced his decision that he was not going to divorce Amber. He therefore asked Ephraim and his daughter not to bother him with such trivial matters again. Jim confirmed to Luke that he had refused Ephraim's offer. Luke didn't understand why the Duke had done so, as it was a good opportunity to annoy the Marquis. But Jim didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't need to. The assistant was clearly confused about what was happening to his master and decided to ask a few questions. He reminded the Duke that Amber is the daughter of a despicable Marquis, and the Duke himself has been recently thinking of annulling the marriage. Jim didn't answer him, just silently wrote something on his documents. Luke stared intently at the Duke, waiting for a reply. But Jim had no intention of answering. He only said that it was getting late and it was time to go back. Luke had no choice but to follow his master. The Duke himself couldn't figure out what was wrong. Lately, he had been thinking of Amber frequently. Even now, walking down the corridor, he would recall her appearance, her hair, her trembling lips, her eyes filled with pain. Scenes of them together, or of him, saving her kept flashing through his mind. And each time, an incomprehensible confusion and a strange palpitation would surge in the Duke's heart. Therefore, he decided not to annul the marriage for the time being, but to sort out these budding feelings. Amber was walking down the corridor, thinking of Missy and what she had said about the Duke. The girl's words lingered in the Duchess's mind, and she repeated them over and over again. Whenever she felt heavy-hearted, Amber would subconsciously grasp her pendant, and then she would feel better. Later, the Duke was walking confidently down the palace corridor. As soon as the servants saw their master, they immediately began to bow, and the butler announced that dinner was ready. But the Duke paid them no mind. He was heading towards Amber's room. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and standing in the doorway was someone she hadn't expected to see. Amber sat on her bed, unable to believe her eyes. She looked in surprise at the man who had suddenly come to see her. This man was none other than the Duke. He walked up to Amber and asked what she was doing. The girl replied that she was just sitting, waiting for him to give him something. She handed him a letter that had come from her father. Jim was surprised by the letter, but when he noticed the Marquis's seal, he felt there was no need to open it. He took the letter from Amber's hand and pondered for a moment. After a minute of silence, he asked if she had eaten dinner, and the girl replied that she hadn't. So Jim invited her to go downstairs with him for dinner. The Duchess was surprised by her husband's behavior, as this was the first time he had invited her to dinner in all their time living together. While she got ready for dinner, Jim waited quietly by the side. On the way to the dining hall, Amber wondered what on earth had happened to him to change so drastically. She had thought he wanted a divorce, which Missy's words had confirmed, but she didn't understand what was happening now. Jim walked majestically ahead, while Amber, lost in her own sad thoughts, followed quietly behind him. A long time had passed since that night, but the Duke's strange behavior had not ended. Amber was in the greenhouse talking with the butler. They were discussing what to order for the winter when the door suddenly opened. Hearing a familiar voice, Amber turned around. Jim was standing in the doorway. It turned out he had been looking for her and was surprised by her decision to decorate the greenhouse. The butler stood to the side, holding a list of items that needed to be ordered. Noticing the list, the Duke asked the butler for it and began to examine it closely. Amber had added her favorite lilies of the valley to the list, wanting to leave her own mark on this place. However, when Jim saw the lilies of the valley on the list, he suggested she plant some other flowers as well. This wish from the Duke melted the Duchess's heart, and she decided to enjoy her last moments with him. The Duke looked at Amber carefully, but said nothing. She gazed back at him, mesmerized, dreaming of seeing the lilies of the valley in full bloom. As the Duke was about to leave, he instructed the butler to place vases of lilies of the valley throughout the palace. Amber was lost in thought. She thought about how her mood had improved and how everything in the castle seemed to have become different. She remembered her life in the capital, where there was no winter like this. It was warm there. She really liked winter and liked that there was so much snow here. Jim was surprised that the girl was so talkative today. According to the girl, it was all because of the snowy weather, which put her in a cheerful mood. However, the Duke was surprised that the snow could have such a great effect on Amber. But no words could spoil her good mood. She continued to watch the falling snowflakes with affection. Just then, the Duke turned to her, looked at her thoughtfully, and was about to speak when he was interrupted by the shout of Luke, who was walking towards them. The assistant was rushing to report urgent news to his master. The news was that magical beasts had appeared on the border again, and the soldiers needed the Duke's help. Jim felt a little sad that he had to leave the palace now. Amber had no choice but to watch the Duke leave, wondering what he had been about to say. She understood that their relationship had changed slightly, but she didn't know why. Suddenly, the Duke slowed his pace, turned around, and told her to wear more clothes when she went for walks while he was away. These words warmed her heart, but the Duke then added that if she caught a cold, she would get sick again and cause him extra trouble. But his eyes still revealed concern and warmth. Amber thought he would say something more, but he said nothing. After that, he and his assistant left, and Amber watched them go, already starting to miss the Duke. It had been 2 days since the Duke left. There was no news, and the girl was very worried about her husband. Amber was drinking tea in the living room when her maid, Lindsay, came in. Lindsay reported that the Duchess had a visitor, and it turned out to be her father. She hadn't expected to see him and had a bad feeling in her heart that something bad was about to happen. The girl walked towards her father as quickly as possible, as she knew he hated waiting more than anything. When she entered the study where her father was waiting for her, he was standing with his back to the door. With a sense of guilt, Amber asked her father what had brought him here so unexpectedly. But her father didn't answer, instead whipping around and slapping the girl across the face. The slap caught Amber completely off guard, as she didn't even understand what she had done wrong to deserve such treatment. As she fell, her father stood over her, arrogant and stern. His face was twisted with rage, and he asked her what she was doing here and why she wasn't pregnant yet. The Marquis yelled at the girl for not replying to his letters, demanding to know how she dared to ignore them. He didn't let her say a word, and she couldn't answer anything as her father glared down at her. Just then, the butler, hearing the commotion, entered the study and asked if everything was all right. The moment the father realized his actions might be seen by an outsider, his expression changed instantly. The Marquis told the butler with a kind face that his daughter had fallen. It seemed, he said, that she was still too weak. He extended a hand to help her up. As he helped his daughter up, he pulled her close and said she was too thin, and therefore, it was no wonder the Duke was unfaithful to her. So as not to arouse the butler's suspicion, he asked with fatherly concern if she was eating well. However, the butler's presence was preventing him from speaking to Amber as he wished, so he sent the butler to make some tea to warm his daughter up. The butler went to prepare the tea, and the Marquis continued to grip his daughter's shoulders tightly. As soon as they were alone, he began to treat her roughly again, dragging her to the sofa. He threw her roughly onto the sofa, and her hand hit the armrest. He began to berate her for her disobedience and accused her of allowing the Duke to meet with another family. Amber could no longer hold back her tears, and to prevent her father from seeing her pain, she lowered her head. He roared that the Duke was meeting with them to annul his marriage to her. The girl replied that she knew about their meeting, which made her father even more furious, and he grabbed her by the collar. The father continued to verbally abuse his daughter and slapped her face again. Amber fell back onto the sofa, and her father reminded her that if the Duke abandoned her, she would no longer be his daughter. But she didn't care. She simply replied that he could do as he pleased, which made the Marquis turn purple with rage. The girl only wished he would finally leave and let her be alone. The Marquis slapped his own forehead, saying that she just needed to listen to him, and then everything would be fine. He told her once again that she needed to conceive the Duke's child to save the marriage. However, Amber's response to this was that she had no intention of having a child against her, and the Duke's will. The fact that his daughter talked back to him made him furious, and he hit her face again. Amber's face already had a deep and painful abrasion. The Marquis finally realized what he had done and understood what the consequences would be if the Duke saw her like this. After all, he was still a man, and she could easily seduce him. And her father didn't care how she did it, whether on her own or with the help of an aphrodisiac. Amber was so filled with sorrow that she had no strength to answer her father. She only felt that it was a disgrace to share the same blood as this man. After her father left, the maid entered the study, and when she saw Amber's face, she was truly horrified. Lindsay had always been very kind to the Duchess, and for that very reason, seeing her like this was most distressing for the girl. The maid immediately ran to her side and began to examine the abrasions her father had left. She was terrified and began to cry out that they needed to apply something cold to it quickly. To clear her head a little, Amber took the pendant the priest had given her from a drawer. As she held it in her hand, she remembered the priest's question about whether she was happy now. She felt immense sadness, and a small tear she couldn't hold back slid down her cheek. She pressed the pendant tightly to her chest, pondering if she had ever been happy. And she found her answer, knowing what she needed to do to finally achieve happiness. Later, the Duke was walking briskly along the path leading to the palace. He had been busy restoring order on the border, which had taken several days longer than he had expected. On his way to the palace, he saw Amber, who was wearing only a dress with a scarf draped over her shoulders. When he saw her, he thought to himself how willful this girl was. She would get sick again, and he would have to deal with her. The Duke called out to his wife, and she turned at the sound of his voice. At first, he wanted to ask why she was out so lightly dressed, but when he saw the bandage on her face, he immediately tensed up. He moved closer, touched the abrasion with his hand, and asked her how she got hurt. Amber didn't want him to touch her and moved the Duke's hand away. He didn't understand why she did that and wanted to ask a question, but the girl interrupted him. Amber began to talk about divorce. She asked him when he planned to file for it, as it was the surest way to end her father's abuse. Jim was surprised that she brought up the topic again. What she said next was a request to end the marriage immediately, right then and there. Amber's words struck the Duke like a bolt from the blue. In that moment, Amber remembered her life, how she had lived with her father, stepmother, and brother. She had always longed for love and attention, but no one in her family cared about her. Until one day, he, the prince, came into her life, took her away, and gave her hope for a better life. They married quickly and lived happily ever after. But unfortunately, that was just a fairy tale. In real life, everything was different. There was no love from her husband, nor care from her parents. During the few days the Duke was away, she had formulated a plan for what to do next. Amber realized that the longer she stayed by his side, the deeper her feelings for him grew. And to stop this torment, they had to annul the marriage. However, the Duke's response to the girl's wish was that the final decision rested with him. Jim added that in this situation, she had no choice in the matter. Holding back her tears, Amber replied that if he was going to do it eventually, it didn't matter when. But the Duke simply wrapped her in his own coat. Seeing the Duchess's sad face, he asked what prompted her to make such a decision. Amber said without thinking that she had always been in his way and that he had said many times he didn't want to see her. But the Duke stopped listening to her and instead removed the plaster from her cheek to examine the wound. The girl, in pain, covered the wound with her hand. The Duke flew into a rage and began to press her about who had done it. But Amber refused to speak, so Jim said he would find out everything his own way. He was furious, but he didn't understand why he felt this way. Was it because she didn't trust him, or because she was hurt? The girl caught up with the Duke, begging him not to torture or interrogate the servants, as they knew nothing. She gently took his hand, making him stop. Jim looked at her quizzically, and Amber asked him what he would do if he found out the truth. Her voice laced with sadness, she added that he didn't care about her injury at all. Jim didn't know how to answer and only said that he was worried about her wound. This surprised the girl, as he had never cared about her condition before. Jim could no longer face this sad and innocent girl. He left without a word. Amber had no choice but to follow him. Later, in her room, the girl composed herself, and Lindsay helped her cover the abrasion. She recalled the conversation in Jim's office earlier. Amber had asked him again why he wouldn't let her go since he wanted a divorce, but she still received no answer. Lindsay and the Duchess were walking down the hallway, discussing preparations for the priest's visit. Amber also brought the pendant that Thomas had once given her. She was going to him, hoping he could help her out of her predicament and that his power could help her find inner peace. On their way to the carriage, they encountered two soldiers sent by the Duke. They informed her that, by order of the Duke, they would be responsible for her protection and would therefore accompany her. Amber was surprised by this move from Jim. The soldiers replied that they would protect her from anyone. From his office window, the Duke watched the carriage depart, confirming that the soldiers were following closely. Jim eventually interrogated the servants, who admitted that the Duchess had received only one guest that day. This guest was the Marquis, Amber's father. The Duke couldn't understand why a father would strike his own beloved daughter. The thought of the Marquis made him want to beat him, and he clenched his fists in anger. Just as he was contemplating the whole situation, Luke entered the office. The assistant brought the Duke intelligence on a matter that had long troubled Jim. Luke had discovered that Amber was not her mother's biological daughter and placed a doctor's document on the desk as proof. Jim read the document and realized the girl was illegitimate, a fatal flaw in aristocratic society. The Marquis had taken a great risk by marrying his daughter to the Duke while hiding the truth from both the Emperor and the Duke. Jim once again remembered her sad and pained eyes. The Duke's assistant declared that this was fraud in a marriage transaction and that those responsible must be punished. The Duke remained silent, contemplating the current situation and his course of action. Luke continued to press, saying Amber also deserved punishment for lying. But Jim had already made up his mind. Without a word, the Duke went straight to burning the doctor's report. He also forbade his assistant from leaking the information they had learned. After burning the last sheet of paper, he ordered his assistant to destroy all materials related to the case. Luke was horrified. He couldn't understand why the Duke was doing this. But Jim ignored his assistant's exclamations, his decision already made. Amber had arrived at the temple to see Thomas. She walked up the steps, with the soldiers following behind to guard her. The girl stopped and said she wanted to go in alone and didn't need an escort. But the soldiers replied that it was the Duke's order. Amber insisted that it was safe here and she didn't need them. The soldiers had no choice but to remain outside the temple. Just before the door, the Duchess heard them say they would post a guard at the temple entrance. As she pushed the door open, she thought to herself how tiring it was to be watched like this. She had just crossed the threshold of the temple when an unfamiliar boy ran up to greet her. He was about 10 years old and also seemed to serve in the temple. He took her hand and said they had been waiting for her. But Amber hadn't told anyone about her visit and couldn't help but start to worry. She asked who was waiting for her, and the boy replied that Thomas was. When they entered the main hall, a priest was already waiting. The boy reported that he had brought the long-awaited distinguished guest. Amber asked Thomas how he knew she would come, and he replied that he knew through the pendant. Hearing this, the girl subconsciously touched the pendant, which was radiating warmth. The priest explained that the pendant contained his power, which allowed him to sense her presence from afar. He added that he had already guessed the purpose of her visit. She needed help. The girl looked at Thomas with sad eyes, feeling a sliver of comfort that at least someone understood her. To continue their conversation, he invited her to sit down for a cup of tea. The boy who had greeted her bid her farewell and wished her good luck. He was beaming with joy at having met such an important guest. Amber liked the boy and wished him good luck in return. As they said their goodbyes, Thomas was already pouring tea for himself and the Duchess. After she sat down on the sofa, the priest asked what was troubling her so much that she would travel all this way to see him. Amber told him everything about her situation with the Duke, and he listened intently. She confessed that she wanted to stop loving Jim and break free from these shackles. But recently, he was always around her, showing strange concern, giving her no chance to do so. After hearing her story, Thomas replied that it was difficult for him to fully comprehend the sorrow Amber was experiencing. However, this didn't frighten her. Just talking about it made her feel much better. Thomas said he couldn't completely relieve her pain, but he could use his power to help her in some ways. But the priest's expression told her that this help would come at a price. Despite this, she agreed. To break free from these shackles, she was willing to do anything. Thomas also agreed to do everything in his power to help her. When Amber returned to the ducal estate and entered her room, she was surprised to find Jim there. His presence startled her, and she asked him what he was doing there. Jim had his back to the door and spun around abruptly upon hearing her question. He approached her with a faint smirk, looking at her with a meaningful gaze. After a moment of silence, his expression changed, and he asked if she was the Marchioness's illegitimate daughter. The question made the pendant box in Amber's hand fall to the floor. The box hit the ground with a thud, but didn't open, for which the girl was grateful. She didn't want to explain the pendant's origin to the Duke. She gave an affirmative answer to Jim's question, which surprised the Duke even more. When he learned the truth, he felt a strange sensation. This girl, an illegitimate child after all, had hidden this secret because it would lower her value in a marriage alliance. Amber felt this was a good opportunity and thought of divorce again, as revealing such a secret was an excellent reason for it. The Duke listened to her, remaining silent. She stood before him, continuing to speak on the topic, while he continued to listen in silence. When she finished, he asked her where she would go if they divorced. He caressed her cheek, saying that returning to her family was not the best option. He moved closer, looking directly into her eyes, and stated the decision he had already made. There would be no divorce, and she would pay the price for her deception. Amber turned her face away and asked him why he was doing this, why he wouldn't let her go. The Duke reminded her that despite his terrible treatment of her, she still liked him. Without giving her a chance to answer, he unexpectedly and fiercely captured her lips in a kiss she hadn't anticipated. The kiss was both fiery and tender. He grabbed her back, pulling her closer. Although the girl begged him to stop, the Duke ignored her and pushed her onto the bed. Amber didn't understand what was happening, why Jim was acting this way, why he was pressing her down firmly on the bed at this moment. The Duke was overcome by a wave of passion, a passion ignited for the very girl he had hated just a short while ago. He kissed her neck tenderly and fiercely while pulling off her dress, exposing her chest. He pulled her dress down to her waist, almost trying to merge himself with her body, his chest pressed tightly against hers. Amber lay naked on the bed, disgusted by what was happening, and she pleaded with him to stop, tears streaming down her face. Jim noticed the tears on her face, stopped kissing her, and wiped a tear away with his hand. A wave of confusion washed over him, and he immediately got off the girl and walked out. Amber was terrified by what had just happened and couldn't move for a moment. After the Duke left, she sat motionless for a long time, wondering why all of this had happened. After that incident, Jim didn't come to her room for several days. Lindsay brought food to her room as she didn't want to go downstairs. However, Amber refused to eat. She had no appetite at all. The Duke had tightened security around his wife more than ever, clearly anticipating that she would try to run away. She didn't touch her food all day. Amber thought long and hard about the Duke's words and felt that perhaps staying at the ducal estate was the best idea. However, she knew Jim hated her, so why was he doing this? Not letting her leave? He didn't care about her feelings, but getting angry was useless, which frustrated her even more. Near midnight, she decided to leave the castle to see if the soldiers would stop her. She had tried to go out in the previous days, and no one had stopped her or asked her any questions. But now, as soon as she left her room, a soldier turned to her and asked where she was going. Amber said she had woken up early and wanted to go for a walk, and the soldier replied that he would accompany her. However, the girl said she wanted to walk alone, and surprisingly, the soldier did not object. This surprised the Duchess, as she had expected the Duke to control her every move. She walked into the garden and stopped, thinking of the soldiers who often patrolled here. She subconsciously touched the pendant, remembering Thomas's words that it would bring her peace. But during their last meeting, he had said that circumstances had changed and he would have to use the power contained within the pendant to help her. When the priest held the pendant in his hand, it began to emit a glow and an incredible warmth. Thomas also said that she had been saved by this power at birth, and therefore a part of this power was also hidden in her heart. To manifest these powers, she only needed to hold the pendant close to her chest. However, Amber's body was not yet ready to use this power, and it could only be used as a last resort. The girl now felt that this was that last resort, and she wanted to use this power to hide her movements. As she was thinking, someone suddenly touched her shoulder, startling her. She thought it was a soldier, but it turned out to be the Duke. Jim asked her what she was doing here so late and where she was going. He held her waist tightly with one hand and gripped her wrist with the other, as if afraid she would run away. Amber disliked this attitude and demanded he let go, to which the Duke, of course, did not respond. Jim ignored the girl's indignation and pulled her into his arms. He carried her back to the mansion without a word. Servants stood at the entrance as they entered, but he paid them no mind. He held her carefully in his arms. Amber tried to struggle out of the Duke's arms, asking him to put her down, but he continued to carry her somewhere. They passed by the servants, who saw everything but simply bowed silently without a word. To Amber's surprise, Jim carried her into his own room and only then put her down on the floor. In a commanding tone, he told her to stay in his room and not to come out. She didn't understand his tone or his actions. Jim left her in the room and decided to go to his study to calm the heat within him. Amber asked him why he was treating her this way. However, he didn't answer and just continued to leave the room. He walked down the hallway, trying not to show his emotions to prevent the servants from gossiping behind his back. Amber sat by his bed for a while, not knowing what to do next. From that day on, she was locked in his room, unable to go anywhere. He would always appear at the door. This made the girl very angry again, and she asked him just how long he intended to keep her. Locked in here. Jim replied that if she kept trying to run away, he would keep her locked up until she calmed down. This truly annoyed Amber, and she had to grip the hem of her dress tightly to avoid losing her composure. The Duke ignored her actions, asserting that she should say she would stay by his side and stop mentioning divorce. The Duchess just scoffed in response. She understood what he wanted. Amber realized he wanted her to continue living with him, to continue being a fake Duchess. However, even if she couldn't find love here, staying by his side was the safest option. Having failed to reach an agreement, he left her in his room again. Amber had been on a hunger strike for several days, and the Duke came to her, trying to convince her that it was a bad idea. He threatened to force-feed her, but she paid him no mind. The Duke tried everything to persuade her to eat, but to all his threats and persuasions, she responded with silence. After a while, she finally replied that she could live just fine without his concern. He sighed, clearly tired of the girl's behavior, but after another moment, Amber finally sat down at the table to drink some soup. After a few spoonfuls, she defiantly pushed the plate away, saying she was done with lunch. Jim realized she was doing it on purpose and told her to stop being so stubborn. He reminded her again that all she had to do was say she would stay with him, and all this torment would end. But Amber didn't answer. She refused to admit anything and couldn't understand his actions. She stood up from the table and walked towards the bed. The Duke watched her every move, quite annoyed by the girl's behavior. After several days of her hunger strike, Amber's condition worsened, and a doctor had to be called. She was sleeping almost constantly, and the doctor insisted that she be forced to go outside for fresh air and that her food portions be increased. After a moment of silence, he added that for a speedy recovery, any psychological pressure from others needed to be removed. While she was sleeping, he stayed by her side, putting all his affairs aside. Her sleep was once again accompanied by delirious muttering. The girl's condition greatly puzzled the Duke. While she was asleep, he began to speak to her, begging her not to leave him. He held her hand, hoping she would share his pain and look at him again as she used to. Amber began to regain consciousness from her sleep. She sat up abruptly in bed, feeling a headache as her vision went dark. Looking around the room, she noticed Jim was sitting on the sofa, asleep. Amber wasn't sure if he was really asleep. She approached him and touched his head, but he didn't react. The girl thought to herself that this was her chance to escape while he wasn't paying attention. Barefoot, she tried to walk very quietly to avoid making the floorboards creak. But after just a few steps, she felt his hand as he easily pulled her into his arms. He held her and sat down on the sofa, saying she was too stubborn. Then he asked where she planned to go this time, and before she could answer, he proposed that she leave with him tomorrow, which greatly surprised Amber. Suddenly, the girl felt a wave of warmth, and her heart fluttered at the Duke's touch. In that moment, she realized she couldn't leave him. Jim didn't want to let her go, and they sat in an embrace for a while. The next day, the entire mansion was filled with lilies of the valley. Seeing all this, Amber was both happy and surprised that he had done this for her. Then he appeared and confirmed that it was his doing. He also said that he was willing to do anything for her, if only she would ask. Amber hadn't expected such a gesture from him. However, this wasn't enough for her. She needed more than just material wealth. She wanted to live in peace and affection, to love and be loved. The girl picked a lily of the valley and lost herself in a daydream for a few seconds. She imagined that one day they could have a complete family with 2 children. But their dreams were completely different, and she understood this and didn't want to endure it. So Amber decided to play along with his game. She turned to the Duke and said she would stay by his side, would no longer mention divorce, and would obey him. The Duke was clearly pleased with the girl's answer and smiled kindly at her. But she secretly decided to continue playing the role of a loving wife. Fortunately, this was easy for her, as deep down, some feelings for him still flickered within her. She used these feelings to lull his vigilance and distract him from her true intentions, which were to leave once and for all. The servants also noticed these changes, often gossiping among themselves that the Duchess was glowing and that the Duke had started spending more time alone with her. In the evening before dinner, Jim was busy with his duties as usual, with his assistant by his side. He was carefully studying some letters when Amber walked into the dining room. Upon entering, Amber greeted him and praised him for his hard work. Throughout the day, the Duke reciprocated her affection and invited her to the table, as dinner would be served soon. Not only the servants, but even Luke was shocked by their behavior and interaction. After dinner was served, they had a very warm conversation while they ate. Jim told her they had received an invitation from Alexandria for a ball to celebrate her upcoming childbirth. Amber was surprised by this invitation, but she understood it was for her, as she was also a member of the family. The Duke handed the letter to Luke, asking him to pass it to Amber. The assistant silently handed the letter to the girl and then returned to the Duke's side. After reading the letter, she realized that almost everyone would be invited, which meant her mother would also be there. But Amber didn't want to see her, knowing it would lead to another scandal. The Duke, as if reading her mind, said she could decline the invitation if she didn't want to go. Furthermore, he himself wouldn't be able to accompany her, but she still replied that she would go. The Duke accepted her decision without objection and wished her a good time. When Amber arrived at the ball, the Emperor's palace was as beautiful as ever. Inside, Alexandria greeted her personally, very pleased that she had come. The Emperor's daughter looked very beautiful while pregnant, and she told the Duchess about all the new things that had happened since they last met. Amber listened attentively, silently admiring the girl. Not far from them stood two girls, whispering and occasionally glancing at the Duchess. Amber didn't like this situation at all and decided to walk around the palace. As she was walking down a hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw her stepmother and was annoyed by the encounter. Anna greeted her daughter in her usual sarcastic tone, saying she was about to slip away without even coming to say hello. The mother moved closer and suggested they go somewhere else to talk privately. But Amber didn't move, simply asking what her mother wanted from her. Annoyed by her daughter's incomprehension, Anna turned to her and asked if she really didn't know about the gossip surrounding her and the Duke. The girl didn't understand what rumors her mother was talking about. Anna was furious with Amber's behavior and started shouting, not hiding her emotions. Her mother told her about the rumors circulating among the nobility and demanded to know if the Duke really wasn't going to divorce her. Amber finally understood what her mother was talking about. Duchess Missy had spread these rumors. Anna was disappointed in her daughter, whose behavior and disobedience were constantly bringing shame upon their family. However, Amber was tired of being insulted and suggested her mother leave. The mother was stunned by her daughter's disrespectful attitude, but Amber ignored her, saying it was late and she wanted to go to her bedroom to rest. Realizing she was losing control of the situation, Anna reminded everyone that once abandoned by her family, the girl would become a commoner on the streets that no one cared about. The Duchess ignored her mother's shouting and turned towards the door. Reaching the door, she reached for the handle, hearing her mother scream at her to go seduce. The Duke, Amber, having had enough of these commands, opened the door and asked the butler to escort Marquis Anna out. The Marquis was practically trembling with rage at this behavior. Amber stopped listening to her mother, and after saying her final words that she didn't care about their opinions, she decided to leave. As the butler led the Marquis to the exit and closed the door, Anna continued to shout threats at her daughter. But Amber didn't care. She had already made all the decisions for herself. She would leave the Duke. No matter what price she had to pay for her own happiness. The next day, the Duchess went downstairs for afternoon tea with the Empress. Emily asked about her and the Duke and their relationship, and expressed her hope that the young Duchess would visit them more often. She promised to do her best, feeling a pang of sadness for having to lie. She stayed for a while longer over tea, chatting with the other girls while fantasizing about how she would escape the Duke and gain her freedom. Tired of socializing, Amber went for a walk in the garden. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew, messing up her curls. It became so cold in the garden, as if winter were approaching. Suddenly, the young priest she had met at the Temple of Thomas appeared before her. The Duchess hadn't expected to see him here, but was very happy about their meeting. They greeted each other, and Amber asked if Thomas had come with him. The boy removed a leaf from the girl's hair and replied that Thomas had come, but he was too busy to see her right now. However, he had asked him to look out for Amber and help if needed. The young priest also introduced himself as Allan. Allan asked for the Duchess's name, if he may, adding that he didn't care about others' opinions. Amber still told the young priest her name. Allan liked the Duchess's name very much. However, Amber was worried about what he was doing alone in such a large garden. It turned out that Priest Thomas had allowed him to go for a walk, which surprised the girl. Allan just shrugged and smiled. Amber suggested he walk with her, as it was easy to get lost in a garden like this. The priest agreed to the offer. The Duchess took his hand, and they walked through the garden together. However, Allan assured Amber that he wouldn't get lost on his own. He admitted that he was actually older than she might think. Amber asked him exactly how old he was, but Allan kept it a secret for now, reasoning that a man with secrets is more charming. They chatted pleasantly as they walked through the garden, also talking about the very busy Thomas. Amber was disappointed that she couldn't see the priest. However, she had heard before that he would be busy for the entire month, and she was leaving in 3 days. But Allan tried to reassure her, saying that Thomas had already given him a task. He said he would help her during Thomas's absence. Allan would help her even after Amber returned to her mansion. But looking at the small priest before her, the Duchess didn't understand how he could help her. Suddenly, Allan stopped and said that he had wanted to keep this a secret for a bit longer. But Amber's reaction was just too adorable. He moved a little away from her, and a bright, warm light appeared around him. When the light faded, it was no longer the small priest who stood before her, but a young man of about 20. Seeing the girl's reaction, Allan smiled and said this was his true form. Amber's mouth fell open in surprise, and the priest explained that he could use magic to change his appearance. He waited patiently for her to come to her senses. The Duchess was very surprised, and Allan apologized for having to deceive her a little. Amber couldn't take her eyes off the priest's new appearance. There was something about him that deeply attracted her. He explained that he was not yet as powerful as Thomas, but he had enough power to help her. Allan approached Amber, and she noticed he was holding something in his hand. In his hand was a small sphere. He called it an artifact that had to be kept with the pendant. He handed the sphere to her, and it emitted the same light, which lasted for a moment. There was a message in the sphere that she had to listen to alone, as there were many eyes and ears around. She assured him that she would do as he said. Allan added that holy magic was not something everyone could possess, and conjured a flower out of thin air. He gave the flower to the Duchess and said that those who possess magic are worthy of the god's love. Since she possessed this magic, she too was worthy of the god's love. Amber, still captivated by Allan, simply looked at him in admiration. Allan returned a warm smile, as if he had seen through something, and said that everything would be all right. Meanwhile, at the ducal manor, Jim was talking with the commander of the soldiers assigned to Amber. He was listening to a report on the Duchess's activities at the Imperial Palace. The next morning, Amber had returned to the ducal manor to see the Duke. When they arrived, her coachman announced that they had arrived. He went around to the side of the carriage and opened the door, only to find the Duchess asleep. Amber was so tired that she had fallen asleep on the road. The coachman called out to Amber again, but she didn't want to wake up. Just as the coachman was about to call her again, someone tapped him on the shoulder. He turned and saw the Duke standing behind him, motioning for the coachman to be quiet. The coachman bowed to Jim and stepped away from the carriage, allowing him to get to Amber. The Duke carefully lifted the girl into his arms and, so as not to wake her, carried her into the ducal manor. He looked at her gently, saying he was glad she was home. Amber didn't wake up the entire time. He carried her into the ducal manor. The day before, the commander of the soldiers had reported that the Duchess had behaved calmly and had not shown any particular activity. He also said that a priest had been with her during one of her walks. Jim was surprised that a priest had been with her and wondered what they had talked about, but the soldiers had been unable to hear their conversation. After hearing the commander's report, the Duke ordered that the surveillance on Amber continue and that everything be reported to him. After the conversation, the Duke thought about Amber's behavior for a long time. These thoughts even gave him a headache. He couldn't fully convince himself of her sincerity towards him. So he decided to observe her in secret. While in her bedroom with Lindsay, Amber asked who had carried her from the carriage. The handmaiden replied that the Duke himself had carried her, adding that they looked very happy together. While Lindsay was envious of them, the Duchess was also pleased with how they looked to outsiders. Needing to be alone, Amber asked for some tea. When she was by herself, she brought the box containing the pendant and the small sphere to the table. She opened the box and looked at the pendant for a moment. When she connected them, they began to emit an incredible light that filled the entire room. A moment later, the sphere cracked open and a small scroll appeared in its place. Amber picked up the scroll and began to read the message Allan had left for her. The message said that he would be waiting for her at a certain place after he finished his business, and if she couldn't come right away, he would wait for as long as it took. However, she knew the soldiers assigned to her wouldn't let her get away. They would follow her even if she just went out for a walk. She burned the note so that no one would know of her intentions. She put the pendant around her neck, hiding it under her dress, and realized that her only way out was to use magic. But she would still try to soften Jim's heart and have him call off her surveillance. She liked this newfound determination that had recently emerged in her. She spent a lot of time with the Duke, walking in the gardens and talking a great deal. They even had lunch together, and as time went on, his attitude toward her grew better and better. However, despite all this, he did not remove the soldiers from her side. Amber stood by the window, watching the falling snowflakes. It fascinated her and calmed her at the same time. She wanted to leave the ducal manor before spring, because the harsher the winter, the more work the Duke had, and the less time they spent together. Today, she even had dinner alone, as he had a lot to attend to. Suddenly, Amber heard a noise coming from the Duke's bedroom. She followed the sound, though she was a little afraid of what she might see. Opening the door, the girl peeked inside and called out to him, but there was no response. So she entered the room and saw him lying on the bed. The Duchess decided to get closer to check on his condition. She found a broken glass by the bedside. Apparently, he had wanted to drink some water, but the glass had fallen and shattered. Amber crouched down and carefully began to pick up the shards so that no one would get hurt. She gathered every piece into her handkerchief and then wrapped it up. The Duchess approached the bed and checked him for a fever, but everything was normal, so she covered him with a blanket. Jim looked so tired, yet so charming at the same time, that she couldn't take her eyes off him. He still didn't wake up. Apparently, he was sleeping too soundly. For some reason, Amber wanted to touch him, and she gently touched his face. She leaned over and called his name, but he didn't respond. He was sleeping as quietly and peacefully as a child. Then Amber sighed, not understanding what she was doing, and decided she needed to call for a healer. But just as she turned, he grabbed her hand. The girl turned her head toward him and saw a look in his eyes that warmed her from the inside. He pulled her closer, leaving little distance between them. They gazed into each other's eyes without a word, savoring the moment as if afraid to disturb it. Jim gently pulled her onto him so that she had to climb onto the bed and sit on top of him. His kiss was gentle, hot, and filled with passion. His hands roamed over her back, telling her how much he wanted her. This passion consumed them both, and they kissed each other greedily, as if they had long yearned for this. He tore the Duchess's dress, tossing it to the floor like the most useless of things. They fell onto the bed, melting into one in a fiery kiss, forgetting everything that had happened between them. To Amber's surprise, the Duke was gentle with her, exploring every inch of her body with tender caresses. He was overcome by pure passion and fire, pulling her arms up behind her back while squeezing her thigh with his other hand. In a moan of passion, she asked if he still remembered their first meeting. He pulled away from her, looking at her with a searching gaze. After a moment of silence, Jim asked if that was really so important right now. Amber, somewhat dejected, replied that, of course, it wasn't important. In that moment, her heart ached once more at his coldness. The Duke looked at her with his gentle gaze and continued to caress her. He grabbed her hips and, gently yet with burning desire, possessed Amber. Jim wished that she would never leave him, and Amber assured him that she never would. They were completely immersed in their love for one another. However, this was her plan, to distract him, to cloud his mind. She had to act decisively. But she too had longed for this, to become one with him, desiring each other as never before. The Duke's tenderness turned to wild passion, making Amber moan with pleasure, which further inflamed Jim. He looked at her, understanding that she was the only person in his life he ever wanted to desire. They both felt better than ever, and then she realized she still loved him. She remembered their first meeting and how important it had been to her. But she was sad that the Duke didn't understand this. Their wedding had given her hope for a better life. Their meetings, though brief, were something she always anticipated with a fluttering heart. Although his coldness hurt the most, she could never forget these feelings, for they were both her shackles and a treasure she had guarded since childhood. But now she still wanted to break free from these shackles. After all, it was unlikely he would ever love her the way she wanted. They fell asleep in each other's arms. When he woke up, the Duke was happy to see her sleeping beside him, and so as not to wake her, he gently kissed her forehead. He looked at her sleeping form, like an angel who had descended from heaven to be by his side. It was foolish to think she would run away from him, as she clearly had feelings for him. He replayed her voice in his mind, felt the warmth she radiated, and realized he was experiencing emotions he had never felt before. And these feelings were real. She herself was real, and she was right here, everything he needed. From that moment on, he unexpectedly removed the soldiers who had been watching her. Amber continued to treat the Duke with awe and love. But the harsher the winter, the less time they spent together. On one such day, Luke came to him in a hurry to report that monsters were once again raging on the border. With a hint of excitement, Jim asked how many there were. The aide reported that their numbers were unknown, but it was known that remnants of the overthrown kingdom had joined them, and the soldiers could not advance with confidence. Jim ordered an immediate departure, and the servants standing nearby wished him victory. But he himself slowed down a bit, which puzzled Luke. The Duke ordered Luke to get the horses ready and wait for him. He himself turned and almost ran to say goodbye to Amber. He rushed up the stairs to her bedroom. Halfway there, she came to meet him, asking what had happened. He told her there was unrest on the border and that he needed to leave for a while. Amber was surprised, as he had never reported his whereabouts to her before. He looked at her as if afraid this would be the last time he saw her. She looked at him in silence, not knowing what to say. He stepped closer and called her name. Before he could finish, she touched his chest with her hand and said she would wait for him. These words made him very happy, and he tried to commit this moment to memory. Her voice, her gaze. However, a question arose in his heart as to whether she was truly being honest with him. But remembering the night they spent together and her recent attitude toward him, he dismissed these doubts. She stood before him, looking at him with loving eyes, and he promised her he would return as soon as possible. And if only she had known what would happen next, she would never have let him go.